Hey everybody, this is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and I'm going to be talking about the Texture Analyzer, which is a piece of software that was developed by, let's try that again. Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about a piece of software known as the Texture Analyzer. It was developed by Dr. Badando, and this software is designed to help you analyze the Gaussian nature of a room, basically, with how diffused it is. Now, I want to be clear in saying that this is somewhat experimental. We don't have a good way of looking at how these numbers correspond with uh, sound quality, but it's been very hard in the past to measure changes in diffusion. So as you add diffusion, the typical measurements we use won't really tell you what's happening to the sound from a diffusion standpoint. And diffusion is not really well understood, so people sometimes misinterpret the data. And this actually looks at the room impulse response and can analyze that in a way that lets us objectively look at changes in diffusion. And so it's a better approach to do for that. So I'm going to start by showing you basically what this looks like. Give me a second to pull this up. Here we go. So here you can see what it looks like when you run an analysis. So I've actually de-identified these rooms so you can't tell who they are since they've come from projects I've worked on. But there's going to be some numbers here that you're familiar with, and then a whole bunch of numbers you're not. So EDT, early decay time, you're all relatively familiar with, right? 0.199. So this number tends to be lower than the RDT or RT60 of the room, but it's often close. This is looking at an earlier start point. Excuse me, for the decay time. Okay, so 0.199, pretty low. This is a pretty dead room. Now, this is the interesting thing. Often people interpret really, really flat RT60s as good. Flat is good, but what if it's flat because it's practically anechoic, really dead? So here we can look at two numbers that are fairly important. That's the normalized ordinal distance, or nOD, of the room, and the normalized ordinal distance total. Total looks at the overall room without, it includes early reflections. And if we look over at the EDF, normalized magnitude, we can actually see what these early reflections look like. So in the function here, we see that there's a bunch of early reflections here, but there's also some later reflections in time. And but we can also see it's a really, really dead room. And so when it tries to fit a line against the idealized EDF, we see that there's a fairly poor match between what it fit, these blue lines here, and the idealized one, the green line. And so when we look at these normalized ordinal distance numbers, we see values of 7.429 for the room and 11.25 total. Why? This room is really dead, but all the reflections are highly coherent. So it's not a well-diffused room. This is actually, because I'll go ahead and let this one out, this is my room when I had put up some absorption in the room, but nothing else. So this is just what that room looked like when it was basically filled with absorption. It was sort of an early stage. Okay. So interesting enough, you're probably thinking to yourself, but what do like good rooms or other rooms look like? So I'm going to go ahead and remove this and add another one. And we're just going to go through some rooms, and then I'm going to show you some papers related to this as well. So if we look at this, this is another room that I had worked on. And here we can see that if we look at the EDT, it's 0.5156. Okay. This was actually a room that I measured before we ever treated it, but it was a fairly sizable room. And you're going to see that the normalized ordinal distance of the room versus total is pretty good. And I'll explain that in a second. But it's what you're seeing here is the effect of a very large space with a lot of stuff of life naturally diffusing the sound. So this is well known. So just as an example, if you were to walk into a huge cathedral, that would have a very well diffused sound field to it. This room has a really good diffused sound field to it because it's so large. This was it was a residence, but it was a sizable residence, lots of reflective surfaces, lots of stuff of life, complex room. And here what we can see if we actually look at this EDF is that there's tons of these early reflections in the 20, 40 millisecond range and earlier. And so they're actually pretty coherent, which is one of the reasons why the nOD of the room is pretty good, but the nOD total is not. So anything under 2 is considered very good. Anything under 1 is really ideal. Anything above 2 is not great. And anything over 5, basically you can consider an audible distortion, right? So you have to look at these two. You can't look at one or the other only. So what this is telling us is that the total is actually pretty close to 5. It needs to be worked on. And the reason is because while it's well diffused over time, in the early first 20 milliseconds or so, it's not. There's actually some strong coherent reflections. So this is not ideal. Even though the room looks good, the total doesn't, strong early reflections. And we know where we need to fix it too. That's kind of the interesting thing of looking at this. All right, let's put another one up. So if we look at this, we can see that the numbers again look pretty good, but actually this time the numbers look good overall. And if we look at the EDT, it's pretty low. This was actually a fully treated room. So you see lots of reflections, but you can see what's happening here. They're other than this one reflection, they're mostly pretty down in level, and they're happening over time quite a bit. This was a moderate, actually pretty large room probably. And we can see that the EDT of 0.292 is low enough. We would consider that pretty good. We can see that the normalized ordinal distance of the room is under 2. It's actually almost close to 1, which is good, but also the total is really good. So this is a well-treated room, and this one came out pretty well, and we can see how this works. And again, look at the ideal EDF, the green line, and look at these blue lines here. I don't know if you can see my mouse actually on the screen, but I'm putting my mouse across it to kind of show you that the dotted line and the other blue line there, they follow it pretty closely, which is why it's so good. Let's remove that one and look at, all right, I labeled this one in a particular way because while it's de-identified, it's not really. I don't think that Gene De La Sala would have a problem with me telling you this is his room. Now, this is his living room, not his theater. His living room is in no way treated. The EDT in that room was really not bad. It's 0.29. And the 0.29 value comes from the fact that there's a good amount of stuff of life in there. The RT60 is actually fairly high, but the early decay time is really actually not bad. It's okay. The nOD for the room is also not great, but not bad. It's under 3. It's 2.995, but the nOD total is not great. So this is another one of those rooms where neither number is great. It could use some treatments, but this room, because it's a large open space, there's a lot of natural diffusion taking place in this room, but there's early reflections that are corrupting it to the point of causing colorations. And this is what's typical of living room systems that are untreated. Often they're actually relatively well diffused when they're big enough because of their size, but they're not that well. There's not good diffusion early on, and there's strong early reflections. And so this is a situation where some absorption in the room would probably help, but actually adding some diffusion in key locations would also help, especially the very early reflections that are causing this. Of course, you're going to say, and this is exactly why Gene didn't do this. Well, yeah, but I don't want that in my living room. So let's look at another room. These are just generically called room 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here we're at 5. So this one, the EDT is 0.37. This is another room where there actually was treatment in this room, but it was kind of being redone a bit because we were trying to make it even better yet. And so you can see that the nOD of the room is 1.17. It's very good, and we can see why that is. If we look at what's going on in the early stuff, there is actually a bunch of well-diffused reflections, but in the very early time, while they're not very high in level, there are some stronger coherent reflections. And so the total isn't great. It's 4.49. In small rooms like this is pretty common. And as long as the nOD of the room is sufficiently low, having a high nOD total is not terrible, especially if it's under 5. So this would be a room that really isn't bad. And this room actually did sound good, even though we're trying to work on these early reflections and make it better yet. So let's go ahead and remove that. We're going to add this to the stage. Here we go. Okay, so for this one, this is another room that was treated. This was actually a professionally treated engineered room. I didn't do this room, and it didn't come out as expected. I'm not going to tell you whose room this is or any of the details of who designed it, but I'll just say that it's a very well-known designer who knows what he's doing. So I don't want you to look at this and say, what the? What happened here is interesting. This is the effect of fabric. So the room is well treated. Should be at least plenty of diffusion in the room. But when the fabric went up, it ended up being put up in such a way that it amplified the absorption area of the room and total absorption of the room dramatically. And it massively negatively affected the performance of the diffusers. Diffusers behind fabric are always compromised to some extent, but they can be made to work, especially if it's a shallow diffuser and it's very close to the fabric. But if you've got a 1 or a 2 inch gap between the face of the diffuser and the fabric, or it's of a certain type, I believe skylines are more affected by this than others, the fabric can basically null out the benefits of the diffusion, because as the sound is scattering off in different directions, which is why skylines could be worse because it doesn't have wells, you end up with these varying air gaps, which cause varying levels of absorption and different angles, and it kind of screws it up. And you can see that in these measurements. The nOD total at 6.619 is not good. That's enough to have a distortion to it. The nOD room value of 2.635, also not good. It's too high. It's not as bad, but it is definitely too high. And then if we look over at the EDT, we see it's 0.115. The room is just dead, and you can see that here. I mean, look at in the early the energy magnitude one, the earlier graph, so the early decay transition time and early decay one. Notice that the blue line, which is the decay time, is just dying. The fitted line, which is the red one, I mean, it couldn't even fit it correctly. It tried and then kind of tapered off, but that tapering is actually, there's no energy there. And then when you look over at the lower one, the EDF normalized magnitude value, the green one is the real value, and then it fit it, the real number to it. You can see there's huge errors in that too, which is why we see those over here in the nOD total and nOD room. So these normalized ordinal distance numbers are telling us a lot about this room. This room didn't sound terrible, just because I think in general, really dead rooms don't necessarily sound terrible, but it didn't have a lot of what I would call like a good room sound. It didn't contribute to the envelopment or spaciousness at all. You tended to just hear the speakers, and they were great speakers, and so it tended to sound good, but the room is capable of sounding much better. We will actually be fixing this room. We're just waiting. We're combining projects. But this is a common issue, and it's why you have to account for everything and be so careful with diffusion in a space. And this tool is so cool at being able to help us. Like, we knew this was a problem, but we couldn't objectively measure it. And now we had this ability to actually look at it. So as I make changes to the room, I can go back and remeasure it, and I'll see different values. And I took so many measurements of the room that I'll be able to do more of a statistical analysis than just a basic, okay, before and after. Because with something like this, a single before and after, if you saw a modest difference, hopefully it's from what you did. It could also just be you moved the mic. All right, so we're going to remove this from the stage, and we're going to add a paper. And you're just going to hate me, but it's worth going through. All right, so this paper talks, I'm not going to go through everything, but it basically talks about these ideas around different aspects of a room. So this talks about within a set of 18 acoustic terms that describe aspects of the sound and acoustic perception while music is played in venues, defining the acoustic texture as the subjective impression the listeners derive from the patterns in which the sequence of early sound reflections arrive at the ears. So basically, when you listen to live music, there should be reflections in that live space. And it's what gives the music its life. It's like its body, its sound, everything you hear, your sense of being in a room with the music comes from that. Now, there's this long argument that's gone on that, well, rooms shouldn't be doing that because your own personal room isn't the room that the music was recorded in, which is very true. And we don't want our rooms contributing to the sound of the music. We want to hear the music as it was intended. But there's a number of problems with that argument. First off, we tend to listen to music in 2 channels. And when we listen to music in 2 channels, we don't have the ability to reproduce all of those texture components. Everything that makes up the texture of a room relies on a 3-dimensional aspect of sound, which is the reflections around the room. And you cannot reproduce that with 2 speakers in an anechoic chamber. In other words, the sound of that and the perception of that requires reflections. So 2 speakers can reproduce that in the room if the room can contribute to the texture. So that's why we treat rooms the way we do. Now you might say, okay, but we don't need to do that with surround sound, right? Because all those reflections can simply be reproduced from the surround speakers. Absolutely. But the channel count is typically nowhere near high enough to get the spatial resolution to do that correctly. And it's very rare that that was actually encoded into the music. You're talking about encoding the sound or the texture of the room into the music itself as the feeds into the surround channels. It's just not how they're being used. So there's a good argument to be made. And I've had this discussion with numerous people, Todd Welty, trying to think of who else I talked to about this. Number of well-regarded individuals, but I'm drawing a blank right at the moment. And they all kind of said the same thing, which was that you can't put too much emphasis on the notion that this stuff might be in the music. You're better off having a room that has this ability of its own. And as a result, surround will sound better, 2-channel will sound better, and the room tends to just be a more pleasant space to be in. You know, we're not turning it into a cathedral. We're not trying to make it sound like a cathedral, but we are trying to make sure that there aren't typical characteristics of really small rooms in residential spaces, which are often characterized by strong early reflections that are very coherent. And instead, we're trying to make sure that the room tends to have a reasonably well-controlled decay time with very well diffused early reflections. And that gives it a more positive texture. So the paper goes on to talk more about this. And one of the interesting things is that if we go down to the previous studies, they talk about this Poes study that refers to mixing time. And that's the time at which the energy is equidistributed in the room. So you've heard me talk about phase mixing. Mixing time and phase mixing are related concepts. When the reflected energy is perfectly distributed in a steady state nature in the room, the mixing time, the time it takes to get there, is what they're referring to. And in small rooms, basically what happens is by the time that happens, the room is dead. So the sound is already decayed off. And so what you're left with is, if you look at earlier mixing times, there's very poor phase mixing that's taken place in most rooms. That's that strong coherent reflections. So the diffusers that have a very good phase mixing capability at a short distance allows you to achieve this mixing time at a shorter time point for good equal mixing. So I'm going to click through, because you should read these papers, but I don't want to get into that right now. I want to show you, and this is all related to doing things with a room impulse response. So here he talks about the acoustic texture parameters. There's transition time, the early reflection RIRs, how he looks at those. All of this is interesting. He talks about early decay time, and then he actually does an early decay time transition time measurement. I didn't get into reading these, but it's probably the better one. He basically is arguing this is a better measure to use for small rooms, or really just a better measure in general. So it's the decay of the early sound field, defined as the time it takes a straight line established between the maximum of an inverse Schroeder integration calculated on the full RIR and its intersection with the transition time, the TT, to decay 60 dB. This new proposal aims to quantify the decay of the real early field. And so basically he's just saying it's a better assessment of that. All right, so let's get into ordinal distance. This is the one I was telling you. So the normalized ordinal distance allows you to look at this across measures that are done in different rooms, but it's first based on an ordinal distance analysis. And so this was found that the ideal early reflecting energy growth curve for a totally temporally diffused early sound field obtained from synthetic room impulse responses of Gaussian white noise is a capacitor discharge function named an ideal EDF. EDF is echo density function. By calculating the accumulated summation of the direct sound and early reflections until the transition time, another function can be constructed, the real echo density function. So here he goes into the math of that. Again, I don't need to go into that for you. And so you can then create a normalized one. So if the length of the curve EDF is idealized to L, you can create, here you can see how he does this, the normalized version, where being Fs is the sampling frequency. That's under here. L he has over here in the calculation. And so you get this normalized ordinal distance, and that's the ordinal distance divided by the length of the ideal echo density function, what is normalized to 1 millisecond. The ideal normalized ordinal distance value, the one that reflects a neutral acoustic texture resulting from the analysis of a set of synthetic room impulse responses made with Gaussian white noise, is less than 1. So remember, I was telling you that like 1 to 2 is really pretty good. Less than 1 is like ideal. So here's where he actually goes and says that. Although the maximum possible value is infinite, magnitudes of more than 5 express great acoustic personality. In other words, the texture of the room is such that you're actually getting a strong sound from the room that isn't a good thing. At that point of analysis within the sound field, the magnitude of the ordinal distance between the echo density functions, the normalized ordinal distance, is mainly affected by large magnitude early reflections. And as long as the same calculation method of the early response room impulse responses maintain, the results of the different calculations from the different acoustical conditions are comparable to each other. So obviously we're doing the same calculations because we're using his software for this. But here's where I wanted to show you, this paper that talks about the mathematics of what that normalized ordinal distance is and why it's useful. All right, I want to show you something else. I think I want to show you this. Here we go. So when version 15 of the software came out, which is the version that we're using, he actually made some changes to it. So he says many times the measurements of the acoustic texture is applied to control rooms, auditoriums, theaters, concert halls, and many other rooms. And the results show a set of reflections with considerable amplitude generated around the sound source. In other words, the speakers. These are observable within the interval ACD, the autocorrelation duration value. There are many times that the result of the normalized ordinal distance texture is conditioned by these reflections, increasing its value, and therefore moving it away from the ideal neutral energy growth curve of early reflections. So we went through that before. We could model these cases as a system with a source whose direct sound is composed of a packet of reflections of duration ACD and a room coupled to it, the independent of everything that happens within said interval. It is very common to find these types of results in control rooms and home theaters, so often what we're dealing with. Considering the above, the designer should be able to determine if the acoustic pathology, in other words, the problem, lies only in the source and or in the enclosure. To analyze these cases, it has become necessary to be able to calculate a new acoustic texture parameter, the normalized ordinal distance of the room. Its calculation is identical to the normalized ordinal distance, but over a different time interval between ACD and TT to exclude these early reflections very close to the sound source. This results in the acoustic texture only of the room. And so you can look at different values like we were, you can compare them. By the way, I was doing mine between 200 hertz and 8 kilohertz. He's doing it 200 hertz to 6 kilohertz. For those of you who are wondering why, these calculations take a while to do. And if you do it over a very wide bandwidth, it gives you results that aren't really useful. They're not more meaningful. So widening the bandwidth doesn't make them better, but makes the calculations take even longer or even sometimes time out. So he shows values of rooms where, for instance, the normalized ordinal distance of the room is 7, but the total is 1.75. He says this from figure 2. And so if we go down and we look at the description of figure 2, he says echo density function of a position inside of a home theater from a monaural room impulse response, because you can do binaural too. And he shows the different lines. It does not take into account the information inside the interval. The total early density function that was calculated, the green filled trace, the ideal EDF, the nOD of the room, and it shows a result that's higher than the nOD of total. So it is advisable to address that. Reflections very close to the source are not responsible for the total texture result. So what he's saying is that when the nOD of the room is really high, but the nOD total is actually kind of low, like this one is, there isn't problems with early reflections. It's actually got some sound to it, some texture to it that's not great, that's happening later in the room. So this is really, I think, helpful information for analyzing rooms. And it's a whole new way of analyzing the acoustics of a room that go way beyond the typical way that we would do it. It requires this extra piece of software. Yeah, there's more research we need to do on it, but it's a really interesting piece of software. And it's a really interesting way of, you don't need to look at this anymore, a really interesting way of thinking about what it is that we're trying to do to make rooms sound better. I like too that we can objectively start to look at some of the stuff we do, because I think it can look like black magic to people. Like it just looks like something that, I don't know, even maybe snake oil, like we're just making stuff up because we can't even prove what we're doing other than to say to you, well, listen with your ears and see what you think. I think if you understand the physics, you know that's not true, and there is actual changes being made. But the room impulse responses, the way we typically analyze those, like looking at the T60 times, doesn't really tell us anything about that. And it doesn't help us to understand the room. And it becomes difficult to see how well diffused it is. There's been efforts to look at the EDT and the way that the reflections look over time. But even the EDT and the distance between the original direct sound and the next big spike in sound, so the first reflection that you see, often looking at that still doesn't tell you very much about how well diffused it is, because you can actually make that look really good with a lot of absorption, but have a lousy sounding room. So this software allows us to start to analyze things in an objective way that should lead to a better understanding of what makes for a good sounding room. If nothing else, it gives us a tool to help us start to get there. So I know this was probably one of the nerdiest videos I've ever done for you guys, but it's part of how I analyze rooms. It's part of something I've been playing with, and I thought that it's something you guys might actually enjoy. So I figured I would go through this, and I thought it was a good follow-up to the video I did before, where we looked at diffusers, where I talked about the importance of diffusers that show good phase mixing around the face. So this is a software that's measuring the effect in a room of having diffusers like that versus other types. If you liked this video, let me know in the comments. Please like the video, of course, subscribe to my channel. And if you didn't like this video, let me know anyway. Still like the video, still subscribe to the channel, and I'll look at your comments and we'll think about other ways to present this. If this information was good, except for you didn't understand it or you didn't find it useful in the way that I described it, let me know and I can think about other ways to try to show this to be more helpful. Thanks, everybody.